They just been lots of wine and lots of celebration. And so we look at this passage and we see a whole lot of things in it. And because we see a whole lot of things in it, I am going to start out and I am going to talk about some of the symbolism that's in this passage. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper. We hear this and we hear a lot of things that we may just kind of ding, ding, ding. Starting with, on the third day there was a wedding. Now, when we hear third day, many of us who are followers of Jesus think the third day that after Christ was crucified and he rose. Now, in this book of John, it seems like on one level he's talking about the third day of his story, but it also, of course, rings to us that it has something to do with the crucifixion and the resurrection. One of the other things that jumps out and that lots of people ask about right off the bat is where the mother of Jesus, who is not named, why is she not named? Well, in the other Gospels she is, but in John, he chooses not to name her. And we don't know why, but I'm just going to throw this out as a possibility. If Mary is not named in this whole story, then she remains someone who is not nearly as important as Jesus is. And so by not using her name, it's keeping the focus on the main event. Another thing that a lot of people get concerned about is when Jesus, after she'd said, well, they have no wine, Jesus says to her, woman, what concern is that of yours? Now, if any of you men call your wife woman, sometimes you might get a little bristly feedback because it sounds a little bit harsh, but in the original language, this was not considered to be harsh. This wasn't considered to be rude. This wasn't. This was just a thing, and so we can let that go. Jesus was not back talking his mama, as we say in the South. He was not back talking his mama. One of the other things that we see in here is that Jesus and his disciples had been invited to this wedding, so obviously lots and lots of people were there. And when we think about that symbolically, just everyone, just kind of the inclusiveness of this wedding. And so Jesus is there, his disciples are there. We're not even really sure whose wedding it is. And then Mama says to these servants, after she's told him there's no wine, implying that he needs to do something, she looks at these unnamed servants, these people behind the scenes, and says, do whatever he tells you. Now, I'm going to loop back to that one later because that's important enough to me that I don't want to talk about that right now. And then we see these 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. The 6 jars, and they hold a lot of water. And we know when we look at numbers as they relate in the Bible that 6 is almost 7, and 7 we think of as the number of perfection, the number of days, the number of completion. And so many times we see the number 7 and we think of completion. So when we see 6, we think, something's missing. I'm going to go back to that one too. And then the symbolism that Jesus did this. Now, in John, he calls them signs. He doesn't call them miracles. Jesus does this sign not in front of the whole wedding party, not in front of everyone like a parlor trick. He quietly manages this, and so the servants, the folks who are not in the eye are the ones who are seeing that. And that kind of shows us a lot of what Jesus does throughout all of the Gospels. When we see Jesus tends to look out for the underdog, and the first will be last and the last will be first. And so he is starting out by doing this sign only in front of people who nobody really pays attention to and who may not ever even tell anyone about it. So there's some of the symbolism. So let's go back, because I'm going to tell you, when I look at Scripture for the week and I think about, what is it that jumps out? What stands out? Everybody in my congregation has probably heard a sermon on this passage, I don't know, let's see, if I do the math, 35 times maybe. And so if your pastors have always preached from the lectionary, you've heard this 35 times. What in the world am I going to say that is going to be any different, or maybe is something that you haven't thought about? And so here's what I got. And it's interesting that on Tuesday, when Dee Burton was kind enough to step in for me and lead the Bible study, even though it was pretty small, it was one of the questions that she sent me as she told me things they talked about as they studied this was the same thing. I'm going to read it and see if you catch it. Verse 6 says, "Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, 'Fill the jars with water.' And they filled them up to the brim." The 35 times that I've heard this preached, I, every single time, have assumed that those jars were empty. But there is nothing in this passage that says that. It says that Jesus told them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. But there's nothing that tells us that those jars were empty to begin with. Now, those rites of purification did require a lot of water. They had to clean every pot and every pan, and we know those Old Testament rules about cleanliness and purification were pretty detailed, and we know that God put those in place. One of the reasons is just to be healthy and sanitary, but so we know that they'd used water. There is nothing in this, though, that says that those jars were empty. So let me tell you a little bit more about those jars. I just got really hung up about those jars. So it ends up that those jars, which I saw some pictures of them, they're huge stone jars. They're actually carved out of stone, so they're just one piece. And they hold, 20 or 30 gallons, so, that's a fair amount of water. Those jars are the only things that no matter what they interacted with, they didn't become ceremonially unclean. So they could cleanse everything, and yet they did not become unclean. Those 6 imperfect jars, because there aren't 7 of them, those 6 imperfect jars when they are interacted with, when they are activated by Jesus and his power, those overflowing jars produce not just $3 cheap wine, they produce this fine wine. So fine that when the steward, the wine steward, who of course tastes the wine and makes sure that it's suitable, he doesn't say, "Ooh, thank goodness you went and found another case of that cheap stuff somewhere." He says to the bridegroom, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." So Jesus' interaction, his activation, creates something that is the best that anyone has had. So there are some other scripture passages for this week in the lectionary, and one of them is from Isaiah. It's 62, and I'm going to try to open this up and read this to you, just a few verses. It talks about how God is pursuing us. Do I have glasses? Yes, I do. Here we go.